Hello, everybody, and welcome to We Measure the World, a podcast produced by scientists for scientists.
Yeah, in the moments leading up to it, walking out of the field site, there was so much wind blowing above that threshold of motion. You're just watching sheets of the beach deflate, right? Deflation is this process where we have the winnowing away of finer material. And that removal of mass causes the surface to, as the name implies, deflate, right? Lower down. But I've never seen it happen this rapidly in front of my very eyes. I mean, it was happening faster than I could possibly measure it with the modern tools that we have.
That's a small taste of what we have in store for you today.
We Measure the World explores interesting environmental research trends, how scientists are solving research issues, and what tools are helping them better understand measurements across the entire soil-plant-atmosphere continuum.
Today's guest is Pete Tereszkiewicz, Ph.D. candidate at the University of South Carolina. His current research focuses on coastal dunes and understanding how seasonal vegetation, such as dune grasses, and sediment interactions affect dune growth and post-storm recovery. So Pete, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, so we like to start off with a little bit of background. So can you just let us know about your background, how you got into this field of dune research?
Yeah, I think a lot of people within the environmental sciences, it's sort of dumb luck that you have that one class that sort of clicks, in undergrad. And for me, it was coastal geomorphology. And I was fortunate too. I took it at a time where I was also kind of getting into surfing, so the ability to do research, but also enjoy being in the same environment for recreation was very much there. And so, I was hook, line, and sinker from semester one, and that led on to a undergraduate thesis that then pushed me into a master's program and then finally into the PhD program. So it was a very organic growth. I didn't finish high school and was like, I'm going to go into dune research, and get a PhD in it. That wasn't the way it worked out for me. It was very much, by happenstance and meeting the right people at the right time. And the dune side of things is very much new. My undergrad and master's was more focused on engineered structures and how those modify shoreline change. And then I kind of wanted to make a small pivot and turn around the other direction, look at the dunes for my PhD research just to kind of balance out, and really glad I did.
Awesome. Yeah, I know we've had quite a few guests who have talked about, like you said, just that, happenstance, like they started in one side and kind of moved to the other. Yeah, like you said, there's a class or something like that. I don't know if we've had any who have said surfing has been their catalyst for moving into into their research field. So that's definitely a first here. So just to start us off, and just for the lay people in the audience, can you give us just kind of a quick intro into why dunes are so important for us and for beach ecology environment?
Yeah. So if we think about the ecological services that the dune itself can provide, it's very much, or it functions very similar to like a levee would, right? So they're really good at being the first line of defense during storm events, and tend to take a lot of that initial surge and beating that storms can provide. And so if you look at that protective service that is available, if you have a strong established foredune in front of your residence, you're probably going to receive much or far lesser impacts from that storm than if you had, say, no dune or a small dune or dunes that are discontinuous, and not pieced together very well. So the biggest benefit is definitely the protective service it provides during storm events, and not even just storms. It could just be a really high tide or just really big wave event, right? Any of those, the dune's going to be able to stand in the way and help out with that erosion.
That was my next question here is, can you tell us a little bit about wind and water and other forces that affect beach dune creation, deformation, erosion, all that kind of stuff?
So when we're thinking about dunes and how they're formed, there's two real main forces at work, right? We have the shear velocity of the wind, so how fast the wind is blowing, how long the wind is blowing for at that speed. Then on the other hand, we have the resisting force of the sediment. The sand will move whenever that resisting force is exceeded by the wind, when it's actually able to physically pick up the particles and move them. When that happens is very site-specific. You're dealing with different mineralogies, which is differences in density, grain shape comes into play, of course, size. And so all those site-specific sort of nuances really make beaches behave individually when we think about resiliency and how they're going to behave in that dune building process. I love it when sand starts moving on a beach, so I could talk about this for hours. So.
Well, that's fine. We got plenty of time, and we'll be covering a lot of this. So with that background, can you just introduce us into some of the projects you're working on, or your main project that you're working on for your PhD research?
Yeah. So as you mentioned in the intro, my work is dealing with understanding the role that vegetation density and seasonal changes in that, right, as we move from winter into the spring and summer months, what that means for volumetric change within the dune.
Hmm.
And when initially trying to tackle this question, the first thing you do is you hit the books, you check out the literature, you see what's been done and what is being done in the field. And a lot of those existing methods, being quadrat analysis, which we, kind of borrowed from biology and
Hmm.
ecology.
Hmm.
You could do frontal area and optical porosity, in which you're photographing the
Hmm.
vegetation and, trying to pull out, how much area the wind is experiencing. Or you could use most recently drone photogrammetry, right, and pulling out by flying drones vegetation coverage from that perspective. But all of those existing methodologies are contingent on you going to the beach,
Hmm.
which is fine. It's a great method. It works. It's one way of answering the problem. But what I was really curious about is what can we put out there in situ to monitor for these longer periods of time, to be at one point over the vegetation in the dune and monitor that growth and that emergence during the spring and summer months. What does that look like? And then how does that maybe tie into the volumetric change signal that we're seeing? And so, yeah, that's why I chose the meter and DVI SRS sensors. And yeah, it's been incredibly interesting to work with them out in that environment. Um, I feel like there's something else to that question I didn't answer.
Well,
I kind of got
no,
lost there.
I mean, I'm interested because you're talking about volumetric change, and my first thought was, is this something where it's actually measuring that volumetric change, or are there proxies for estimating that change?
Yeah. So the drone flights are definitely the main methodology that I'm using to calculate volumetric change.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, but also in the field of view of the sensors, I've installed erosion pins, which are
Okay.
these like tiny little sticks, and you go out there. They're very rudimentary.
Hmm.
You measure them right in time one, and then the next visit you measure them again, and you have some sort of indicator of how much change occurred.
Got it.
So that's just in the field of view to have a sort of check resource. There were some issues with those, just really noisy signals. And I think a lot of this just comes down to, the flow and the eddies that are forming around the individual reeds of the vegetation.
Hmm.
And there's something I didn't foresee being a problem, but it doesn't make enough sense to where, I can say, hang my
Right.
hat on and say, yeah, that's exactly what's going on in the dune. And I think it's just this microscale process he's coming through.
How do you deal with messy data in your specific research?
I think the way I've been trained by my advisor, and I think it goes for a lot of scientists out there, is, we don't really smooth the data too much. That's
Hmm.
just
Hmm.
not, what you get back from the natural environment, like that is what you have. And if you're dealing with something where you have all this wave data and you want to pull out tides and you downsample, that's one thing. But
Hmm.
looking at a noisy environmental signal, I think what we tend to fall back on is just how many standard deviations is it off,
Hmm.
by,
Hmm.
or what
Hmm.
is the variance, and then does the variance of that particular signal outweigh, sort of the resolution of the change that we might see. And if that's the case, then it's got to go, right?
Right.
But,
Right.
still learning, right? Every data set's unique and different and poses different challenges.
As you're out there, how long is your field season when you're doing this research, when you're taking these measurements or going out to the dunes themselves?
Yeah. So I installed all my equipment out there January 10th this past year, and they were out there up until Hurricane Ian.
Mm.
But for the dissertation work, just because of the compressed timeline,
Hmm.
I only present up until about August, that particular chapter. But, the full-blown publication will have work all the way up until Hurricane Ian happened and those
Okay.
instruments were pulled. So,
Right, right. And that's definitely something interesting. I definitely want to touch on Hurricane Ian. For those who are listening, we're recording this in October of 2022, and Hurricane Ian, which peaked at a Category 4 hurricane, was, pretty devastating, and it passed right by where Pete was doing his research. So we'll get into that here in a little bit. I did want to come back. You had mentioned using NDVI and PRI sensors. Can you just do a quick explainer about how those kinds of sensors work and what you do with them within your research?
yeah, sure. So both the NDVI and PRI SRS sensors are a combination of your hemispherical or upward facing sensor that gets the changes within the natural environment. If it's cloudy one day and sunny the next, right? You want to account for that. Then you have a field stop sensor, which is looking down on top of your vegetation. So NDVI has been used widely in the remote sensing community, I would say, I think since the 70s,
Hmm.
for getting at vegetation density, the density changes, and can also be used for like leaf area index and other indices like that. And then PRI has been recently shown to be a really good indicator of vegetation stress. And so when thinking about using these, my two main questions that you touched on in the introduction is how do seasonal changes in vegetation density, affect volumetric change? That's the NDVI sensor. Then in turn, being that these dunes are existing on this really, just crazy interface between land and sea that's exposed to, frequent storm events, high tides, drought, other sorts of, disturbances. They get hit with a lot of stress. And I really was curious to see if a stressing phenomena occurred, what would that PRI signal look like, right? Because the benefit of having these sensors out there is that I'm getting an hourly record of this change. And so.
Right. Is that something where you need that kind of granularity? So you're talking about hour per hour type of recordings. Would it be better to have something even quicker than that, or what are the issues with that kind of granularity?
Yeah. I think a lot of this comes down to the scale I chose for my field study, and a lot of, record it hourly because it's easier to take in more data and then downsample versus, obviously go the other way.
Yep.
And so by going hourly, what I'm able to do is I'm able to take a number of readings around noon and then average those out, and that's my one value for the day. A number of our data sets, at least the ones tied to vegetation growth, come down to a daily recording, a daily value.
Okay.
And so because of that, only a day is what came out of it in the data, but that granularity was just decided on based on other instruments at play and trying to compare, apples to apples. But in terms of if a smaller resolution is needed, I wouldn't think so, but I'm also not a ecologist or biologist. I'm borrowing some really cool toys they have to try to get at my question within coastal geomorphology. So
Right.
I can't fully answer that question.
Right.
But.
So how have the results looked so far with this project?
Yeah, the coolest thing that's come out of it is an inflection point, right? Actually being able to see that, and I'm sure your listeners that are either in the agricultural field or, in the biology fields that use these sensors already. Yeah, I get an inflection point every spring. Like we know this exists, but
Right.
but as I mentioned earlier, right, we in the coastal and aeolian world, we didn't have this sort of resolution in situ looking at a plant to see that inflection point. So if my field visits were before the inflection point and then after, I just average that out, right?
Yeah.
Why the timing of that inflection point matters. And when I say inflection point here, I guess I should describe because I've been looking at the data a lot.
Please.
But it's around like March 22nd, there's this explosion of growth, almost going from, a straight line to logarithmically changing daily. And so why that really matters is the timing of that inflection point, when the plants start budding out or blooming out as we move into those warmer months. How does that relate to when the winds are blowing at a speed that they can move sediment? Right? And the occurrence of those two variables, are they in tandem or are they not? Because I think, and I can't, fully answer this question yet, but I think that's what really gets at why systems or some systems are resilient and recover much faster than others. Having worked on Pensacola Beach as well as along South Carolina's coastline, there's a huge difference in how these systems recover. Pensacola might take 10 years to recover to a certain state that it only takes South Carolina a year and a half to. And why is that? And that's kind of a little bit more background into why I sort of chose this question for my dissertation work.
With all this going on, what are some of the other special challenges that you're facing in doing this kind of research?
Yeah, I guess I'll start back at the beginning. I was fortunate enough to be a Grant Harris Fellow in 2020, which was awesome. That announcement came like right before the first major lockdown came, and the big challenge there, I was scrambling to get the shipping address changed to my house, nervous about that equipment actually getting to me, right? Because the supply chain was in upheaval, and so that definitely posed a bit of an issue. And then once I had that equipment delivered, where to test it at. Like everyone else, I was growing potato plants in my backyard. So that's what I tried the sensors out on, and learned really fast that if your canopy is producing all sorts of shadows in your field of view, the sensors really don't like that. But, obviously that didn't really matter for the dissertation work because the beach, there is no tree canopy over the top of the sensors, so it wasn't too much of an issue. But so that was definitely one of the challenges. The next one was definitely choosing the location of the sensors. And I think a lot of field scientists out there can relate to this, where you build up these experiments for months into years potentially, and then it's game time, right? You got everything ready to go. You hit the beach, you're deploying, things are going smooth, right? But before you can actually start that process of installation, you need to look at the landscape again and verify that where you're going to put them makes the most sense to answer your questions.
Mm-hmm.
For me, unfortunately, as I mentioned, this is a system that's typically disturbed by
Mm-hmm.
nor'easters, high tides and storms. And so naturally, when I went out there, like maybe a few days before, I got hit with a nor'easter, and it just really decimated the site because it wasn't just any nor'easter. It was one that was a real jerk, and he sat offshore and just pumped waves during multiple tidal cycles, right? So you have
Mm-hmm.
localized, sea level rise from the high tide, right? And then you have waves coming in on top of that, and then the next tidal cycle, same thing, next one. So it really did a number and scarped my dunes, which is where you're removing volume from the front or the toe of the dune. And it
Mm-hmm.
can result in what looks like a cliff. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
scarping across the site, removed a lot of sediment. It deposited what's known as rack, which is like the vegetative remnants of former dune grasses or marsh
Mm-hmm.
species, and it gets sort of balled up and placed on top of the surface. And
Mm-hmm.
so that changed the initial game plan strategy, right, that had built up over multiple years for this
Mm-hmm.
deployment. And so when thinking about sensors that are trying to measure, vegetation growth and health, I didn't know if I was putting my sensors on top of vegetation that was so stressed it wasn't going to come back in the spring, or,
Right.
if it was a viable candidate. And so
Mm-hmm.
I kind of just rolled the dice on it, made the best educated guess I could, got some right, got others not as ideal. But the way I look at it is this was a pilot study in a lot of ways of
Mm-hmm.
these sensors that have been traditionally used in agriculture haven't fully been vetted in a sandy environment, with grasses that aren't necessarily planted a certain way, right? And so there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of curveballs that are going to be thrown at it, and that's what led
Mm-hmm.
to a lot of bench testing before I even deployed these things. There's a whole multiple months of just stripping the system down to its core variables of grain size or moisture content and
Mm-hmm.
what different elevations of the sensor over bare sand looks like, and is that signal trustable, or can actually use this data just looking at the clean, no growth of vegetation kind of in the mix of that. So
Yeah. With all of that going on, I do want to come back to your COVID lab. You'd mentioned dealing with COVID restrictions and traveling and social distancing and all those kinds of things, and trying to do things in your backyard. But you also created some indoor test beds as well. Can you tell us a little bit about trying to imitate dune conditions indoors?
yeah. So for those bench tests, I ended up building basically a sandbox, right? And so it like really brought me back to childhood. Obviously, I'm like playing in this massive sandbox. But that was mainly done in order to, like I said, strip down the natural environment. Like, what about the
Mm-hmm.
beach is different from an agricultural field, And number one, that thing that stood out was grain size, right? And then not just one type of grain size, but how does that sensor respond across multiple grain sizes, from the very fine that builds up the dunes to very coarse and chunky gravel, right? How is that signal coming back? Is it affected by this or not? And then with the sandbox, I was also able to, do different tests with moisture content. And so
Mm-hmm.
for that, I had my sandbox, did the dry run, took a reading. I used the ZL2 for that, which is like a little handheld Bluetooth data logger that you guys have. That way I could get quick, rapid readings, because if you think about it, you add moisture, you really can't wait 20 minutes because the sun is
Right.
evaporating that off, right? So yeah, added that, would take a reading, and then with a little pump like pesticide sprayer, add more moisture on top of it.
Hmm.
And then the whole time taking gravimetric moisture scrape samples, which is essentially just to have some, bona fide metric of this is how much moisture was within that sandbox at that period of time. And that process took a number of iterations just because, I thought I saturated the surface. And then when I got all the gravimetric moisture samples back, it ended up only being like maybe like 5%. And it's like, oh, back at it, and so
Right.
like really try to get the pump sprayer going, and
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
but yeah, it was really fun period of time, just really trying to throw the book at the sensors and just
Right.
see at what point the reading has more noise than I feel,
Mm-hmm.
trusted that it can actually go in the field and perform. But yeah,
Right.
everything came back from that less than 3% of the operational index range, which is, I mean, pretty incredible. And the one that was like the highest was the most unrealistic, in which you're changing the sensor out in each data log report,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
that wouldn't happen but maybe once. But we just want to see in case for some reason there was a massive failure because of dune scarping and it had to replace all the sensors,
Right.
what error could that possibly introduce? And so really you're looking at on the order of less than 2% of, the whole index, which is, I mean, I was surprised. I just knew the different grain sizes were going to, throw a wrench in the whole plan, but no.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I know you mentioned indoor. I did try to use them indoor, but that did not work out too well. It was very
Hmm.
noisy, so I
Hmm.
had to kind of move everything outside, which was probably for the better. I got to hang out with the sensors and get some good vitamin D, and it
Right.
was a good excuse to be outside. Of course, it drew a lot of looks whenever we were back on campus testing some stuff out, and
Hmm.
everyone's walking, on campus to and from class, and there's this guy with a sandbox, kind of reading a book while it's just looking at bare sand, these
Right.
downward facing sensors. It just didn't make any sense. No one asked questions, but they were probably thinking like that is the weirdest thing.
So, I mean, that seems like just an immensely time intensive process, manually spraying things, checking things over and over. You said there are multiple iterations. Like, how long does this process take overall?
Oh man, just the experiments, I would say probably about 3.5 to 4 months. Especially the moisture content, I would say took the
Right.
longest, just because, as I mentioned, you don't really know until you get the oven results back, right?
Yeah.
So if you're too low, or maybe you missed this range in the middle, right? So in order to make a complete data set, it just took a lot of time, a lot of lab
Hmm.
work as well as field work in order to get that figured out. And that doesn't include the time to build all the sensor mounts.
Hmm.
That was a
Right.
different set of time involved. But like I tell people, it's like this is the science to get to the
Yeah.
science, right? We're
Yeah.
only as good as the measurements we have, and if we don't know what those measurements are, then you know the confidence isn't quite where it could be, if we
Hmm.
just do all this background testing before.
Yeah. Could you just, yeah, run us through like what types of discoveries or trends you'd been seeing with that data specifically? And you talked about grain size and other things, but yeah, can you just give us a brief recap of what you found in doing those experiments?
Yeah, yeah. The synopsis of it all is that it was a really flat line, which is good, right? These sensors are incredibly stable,
Hmm.
depending on if you are, changing grain size or moisture content or the instrument height over bare sand. So, yeah, it was a really boring result, but that's okay. I'm okay with that, whenever you're dealing with validation studies like that.
Right.
Obviously, at that point in time in my academic career, I was ramping up for comprehensive exams, and like I had this field
Mm-hmm.
project ready to go, and everything was coming
Mm-hmm.
together. And so
Mm-hmm.
initially, you don't think about the benefits of it. You're like, this is very frustrating and inconvenient, and
Mm-hmm.
why now, right? But it really gave, yeah, a lot of time to slow things down, think through the science, and I think it's what led to like really strong experiments. Otherwise, I would have been compressed for time. I might
Right.
not have done half those experiments,
Yeah.
and then I would have always wondered, right? So, yeah, I think the benefit there was not only more time for experiments, but also more time to just read in general. I mean, I think that's a big, a big part of, that extra time that we kind of got.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to come back to talking about Hurricane Ian. I wanted to just kind of get a ground level view about how you deal within your research in your field of study. I mean, hurricanes are one of the central impacting forces in coastal geomorphology. And how do you work around or work with hurricanes, tropical storms, or other major weather events like that?
Sure, yeah. I feel like in our field, it certainly is a factor. I wouldn't say we can ever plan on them, but we better make sure we have a contingency plan if they come.
Mm-hmm.
I think
Mm-hmm.
it's the best way to put it. Yeah, no, so for planning purposes, I know like whenever I first installed in December, I'm looking at the landscape, I'm looking at where I'm at, which I'm operating within what's known as a washover plane. So this is where it's a flat, sandy area where years ago a storm came and blew through the dune system, kind of spread this sand apron, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
across the landscape. So there's very little resistance there, and that's why high tides would flood it, or a strong nor'easter would flood it. Going into this project, I kind of knew, I was like, if there is a storm, there's a good chance it's gonna destroy the dune system that's here, or the one that's trying to recover and bounce back.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so December through to June, I had a lot of time to think about, okay, what is my, threshold for pulling instruments versus not? And what does that look like? How many people do I need? How much heads up can I guess, be expecting? Am I going to have
Mm-hmm.
a couple days to make this decision, or is it going to be a
Mm-hmm.
6 hour decision I have to make? Then how does that change sort of like my plan of attack?
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I think a lot of it going in is just that contingency plan of what needs to happen. But the
Mm-hmm.
frustrating thing with these storms is even when it looks like there's a potential they might hit, the track shifts so much, and you're only as good as the information you're given. And obviously, like NOAA and National Weather Service does a phenomenal job, and they give us the best possible prediction they can provide.
Mm-hmm.
But there's just so many variables at play that
Mm-hmm.
the track can shift dramatically. And that's what
Yeah.
happened with the second landfall of Ian.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of my questions was like, well, how do these dunes respond to vegetation stress?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so when I made the call to go out on the Thursday before the storm to pull down my met station, because I had other instruments out there that were not mine, and I'm trying to graduate. So if I destroy my committee member's net radiometer, it's probably not going to go over very well for me.
Right.
So I was making an emergency visit for that. But, with the vegetation sensors, I really had to think about leaving or not, right? And, I think a lot of field scientists do this mental calculus of, is the data I'm going to get or the potentially get worth more than the risk of losing the equipment? And so that really drives your decision to leave or pull it out. At the time, the storm was projected to hit south of Charleston, which, knowing this coastline, it means that, all we get is higher waves, some more wind, and, we still get the surge, but not nearly as bad as they would experience it in Charleston area. And so looking at being out there the day before the landfall was made, it was really impressive how much energy was already in that system. I mean, the winds are whipping already, and Ian was kind of unique. There's like a cold front, I believe, kind of pressing it offshore and squeezing some moisture out, so that I feel like enhanced some of the winds that we were experiencing up in that part. But in the moments leading up to it, walking out of the field site, there was so much wind blowing above that threshold of motion. You're just watching sheets of the beach deflate, right? Deflation is this process where we have the winnowing away of finer material, and that removal of mass causes the surface to, as the name implies, deflate, right? Lower down. But I've never seen it happen this rapidly in front of my very eyes. I mean, it was happening faster than I could possibly measure it with the modern tools that we have, and it was really incredible to see. But in that process, looking at my instrument nodes, because I kind of have them set up where I have these 3 dunes that are more or less coalescing, varying degrees of vegetation coverage. And so I split up, and I had 2 ZL6 data loggers, and one was kind of further back and one was closer, towards the ocean. The one that's closer towards the ocean, there was so much sediment, it actually buried all the vegetation that was within the field of view. Wow. So that had already occurred. And so for me, looking at that, I was like, well, thinking back to my research question, it's like, well, I don't even see the vegetation, and so, and the data logger is about to get buried by sand. It's like, I don't think it's a good idea to leave this one in place. But the other one is further back, further away from the ocean. Storm was going to hit south of Charleston, so there's a good chance it'll get scarped. There's a lot of mass ahead of that station, and so I feel pretty good about where it's at. I reinforced it, and I left it. 6 p.m. that night when I got home, the track shifted. It was a number of miles.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and so the center of the eye actually was half a mile away from my study site, which means that my dunes went through the northeastern corner of the eye wall, which is the strongest winds, the most intense part of the storm, because it's centrifugal force. And so, yeah, that's what it looked like when I got out there a couple days after. It was basically all of the sand was just stripped from the dunes and pushed back. So that same overwash plain I mentioned earlier, a brand new formation of that occurred. The sensors are still out there. They're buried. I have to find them. But it was one of those things. It was a game time decision, in my defense, if it would have hit south. And I've seen them move south too, just as much. And then you don't get any data, right? So it was a risk, and I took it, and didn't bode too well. But I didn't lose everything. But the opportunity to see what that vegetation stress to tropical systems was just too appealing to not try. Right. And so, and that's ultimately what the PRI sensors were out there for anyway. So they were doing their job. It's just the storm at that magnitude. I mean, incredible force of nature. And that was only the second landfall. When it's just a Cat 1, I can't imagine a Cat 4. I think, a lot of researchers in my field, we do kind of chase after these storms whenever they're kind of in our backyard, just because there's so much information we can learn from it. And so I've been on several survey crews where we go out before and then after and, calculate erosion and shoreline change. But I think being at this site for like the 8 months prior, watching it grow, watching it establish, and the vegetation really come into its own and stop sand from moving and building up those dunes, then coming back right after the storm and seeing it obliterated. Yeah, it was powerful. I did not expect that.
Like you're saying, it's kind of the flip side of the same coin of tornado storm chasers, where you guys are just kind of staying in one spot, but dealing with the same thing about how do we measure the impacts of these major weather events without, losing all our equipment or, finding the right spot or to move them out of the right spot in order to figure out what we want to see, what we really want to be able to record there. How long then does it take for a dune like that to recover from a major storm event, such as, a major hurricane? It might be just a matter of months, or is it years? Can you give us a general ballpark timeline of those kinds of situations?
Oh, I wish I could. Yeah, it's incredibly site specific. But just to kind of clue you into some of the variables that we're looking for, what could make a stronger system is number one, you have to have some form of what we call roughness. So roughness is just anything that could slow down the wind, decrease its momentum, in which it can no
Mm-hmm.
longer carry the sediment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that
Mm-hmm.
process of decreasing its momentum means that it's no longer able to carry the sand particles. It falls out in terms of deposition, and then that kind of jump starts the process. So that's number one, something to stop the wind when it is carrying sand. But even stepping back, though, you need sand, right? You need a sediment source. And so, depending on the magnitude of your storm, that sand gets relocated and it can go in one of two directions. One of which would be, like in the case of my study site, it was blown back through to the backside of the barrier island. If it gets pushed too far into the marsh and is now underneath the water level, then that sand is more or less lost because
Right.
I don't care how hard that wind blows, it's not going to pull it out of the water and back on the surface, right?
Right. Right.
And then another direction in which the sand could go is offshore. These storms are of such high magnitude, that it's pulling the sand and sort of grinding it off the beach and can shove it far offshore to where the normal waves that typically act within a climate aren't able to
Mm-hmm.
bring it back to the coast. And typically you'll see beaches will have like what we call like a winter and a summer profile where the wintertime it's a steeper beach because there's more wave energy. And it's pretty normal for those waves to just take that sand, move it offshore, and then it builds up the bars, which the surfers like, right? Surf's
Mm-hmm.
much better,
Mm-hmm.
swells are cleaner.
Mm-hmm.
But then as we move into the summer months, there tend to be these lower waves, but they're sort of like bringing these bars and bringing the sediment back to the surface. And so we get this more gradual profile that builds out wider, more room for people that want to come to the beach for tourism or,
Mm-hmm.
sunbathe, that sort of
Mm-hmm.
thing. And so this process normally happens, but hurricanes can be on such a high magnitude that they take the sand off the beach,
Mm-hmm.
but they move it beyond where it can be recovered in those summer
Right.
months, from
Right.
those normal processes. And so whenever that happens, then you need to call in some sort of human intervention, I guess, needs to take
Hmm.
place, right? Whether it be the Army Corps of Engineers or some
Mm-hmm.
other
Mm-hmm.
dredging operation, beach nourishment, something along those
Mm-hmm.
lines. A soft management practice kind of brings that sediment back. And I'll say that roughness, in my case, it's vegetation, but it could be a sand fence, it could be a bundle of hay, anything that can slow it down.
Okay.
Roughness, we got sediment. Ultimately, winds, and the angle at which the wind is going to arrive to the coast, that governs change and transport because it's all about boundary layer adjustment and how the wind is essentially getting used to the surface it's moving across, which
Mm-hmm.
takes time, And so, yeah, having ample space for that boundary layer modification to occur. I think that's the main ones. And of course, you got precipitation, which, turns transport on and off. Dune really is this sort of like analog result of transport and depositional processes,
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
interaction of when sand's moving and when it stops. And then that ultimately is what a dune is.
So along with that, as that dune is forming or starting to form, can you explain the process of how grasses begin to take hold and how long does that or how long can it take for, grasses to take hold within a dune and become embedded and flourish there?
Yeah, man, what a cool question. And the reason why I say this is because I think what I initially pitched to Meter a few years ago was only looking at those three dunes that are now destroyed. That was like the
Mm-hmm.
main focus. But when I pulled up to my study site back in January this past year and installed everything, seeing how much rack, right? Remember that's the
Mm-hmm.
vegetative remnants
Mm-hmm.
kind of balled up on shore, was on the field site. We kind of pivoted a little bit and said, well, let's look at this too, because rack isn't just dead debris. It's typically, because it's been scoured and mined from a dune, it tends to have vegetative remnants that are reproductive, so either it be rhizomes or seeds.
Mm-hmm.
And also, too, it's unique because it's also a roughness element, right? It's able to
Right.
extract the momentum from the wind and facilitate deposition, which is what a dune needs. And so I kind of pivoted a little bit and then also, threw some erosion pins inside the rack and then photographed them, did vegetative counts per rack piles. And I divided the
Mm-hmm.
study area where it looked like it was more influenced by aeolian activity versus inundation from tides, and I had a control set as well. And yeah, what really came out of that is it really highlighted the role that rack has in that recovery. That an initial disturbance event levels the whole dune system. There's nothing out
Mm-hmm.
there. But these lesser events are able to float in rack. So maybe it's just a high tide, deposit a rack pile. Now you have roughness on the surface. As your winds start to blow, you're infilling this rack pile and then causing it to really jumpstart colonization and emergence within the system. And dune grass species are really interesting in that they like burial, or a lot of them do, not all of them, but
Hmm.
a lot of them do. And so there's a stimulus that happens of sand now buries the rack pile where the vegetative matter is, or the reproductive components are, right? And then now you have a burial response, which then causes that plant to want to grow, through the rack pile, through the sediment. And then that growth now causes it to have a bigger presence to the wind field, which facilitates further deposition, right? And so this process continues over time until eventually you get a dune out of it, right? This
Hmm.
form is able to modify the landscape and modify the flow, and in a lot of cases to its favor, towards slowing down that wind and aiding in that growth. Yeah.
So, are there other types of plants that can help in this beyond dune grasses?
Yeah, yeah. Some of the work I've done recently has been looking at the role of driftwood kind of in the system, right?
Hmm.
It's something that's not necessarily alive like dune grass is,
Hmm.
but its benefit in terms of nutrients is this long-term source of nutrients, right? As it breaks down slower because of its size
Hmm.
and its mass, but it kind of helps that system of establishment. And so I know it's not really a plant per se. Everything else that's going to be on the surface is going to be some form of dune grass
Okay. All right.
species. So
Okay.
whether it's like your bitter panicum or American beach grass or sea
Hmm.
oats, they're all kind of within a similar class.
That was my question. So, are there any issues with beach degradation, say, outside beyond your region of research there?
Yeah, yeah, I think a lot of that kind of comes down to the underlying geology of the region. And what I mean by
Hmm.
that is your beach slope is much steeper on the west coast than
Right.
it is on the east
Right.
coast or the Gulf Coast. And because of that, if we think about things like sea level rise or like localized sea level rise because of storms, the same amount of change vertically means two different things because of that difference in geometry, right? When we think about
Hmm.
slope. And
Hmm.
so I think that's why we see a little bit more erosion, maybe more visible, perhaps,
Okay.
on the East Coast and Gulf Coast. But yeah, not saying that erosion doesn't occur on the West Coast. It definitely does. It's just it looks a little different because of that, like I said, that geologic framework, and
Right.
also in a number of places, you have kind of like negative sea level rise values because of the isostatic rebounding, right? As those glaciers
Mm-hmm.
push back
Hmm. Hmm.
thousands of years prior, that land is still bouncing back up, and so
Right. I have heard of beach grasses being imported elsewhere, introduced to other places to protect beach dunes in other places. Is there any risk of beach grasses becoming invasive species in these new areas?
yeah, this is we're seeing a lot of this on the West Coast right now. I haven't done research into it myself, but I have several colleagues who do. I don't remember if it was introduced by the Fish and Wildlife or if by some management agency or not, or if it just naturally floated across. But European beach grass is really aggressive at growing tall and fast.
Hmm.
And so what they're seeing over there is that, yeah, it's growing tall and fast, which means that it's sort of cutting off the sediment supply to the native species behind those regions and is becoming a real issue in terms of natural biodiversity, right? And then in terms of other invasive species, there has been a lot of work done on it. What I don't remember though is if those were intentionally planted or not. I don't know. But what we
Hmm.
also see though on dunes is the sort of invasion of centipede grass, right?
Hmm.
As we have these homes and properties along the coast, obviously we want a
Hmm.
centipede long yard, and so by planting that, sometimes it also will crawl out onto the dune. And I don't think it poses as much of an issue in terms of like out competing, just because dune grasses are incredibly resilient to salty air, to long periods of drought, to like full sun exposure. And so, yeah, they can hold their own, I guess, against that.
Right.
And I did misspeak earlier. There are succulents or succulent type species that do pop up here on the East Coast. There's
Okay.
gonna be like sea rocket, but they're kind of like one hit wonders. They'll pop up, a little bit of roughness, to the surface, and then they're
Hmm.
gone.
Hmm.
So they do exist, and they are, very beneficial for initiating some of that initial deposition.
As we kind of wrap things up here, I'd love for you to just explain to our audience about how can your research help the world at large, or what can we as a society learn from the result of what you're finding out?
Yeah, yeah, I think a lot of where the benefit of my research as it stands right now is going to go is to offering this new methodology, this new lens to see vegetation data through from this like in situ perspective, right? As I mentioned earlier, these inflection points. I really think there's a lot of strength in understanding the timing of that emergence with, local conditions of wind patterns, and if it's the rainy season or not, and how those different variables interact with one another in terms of being able to put a number of different study sites or different locations around the country on the same playing field, right? A way in which we can distill it down to these core variables and measure resiliency, or get at, why does it take this beach X number of years to recover, whereas this one can do it in half the time? Because ultimately that sort of information tells us which systems are efficient. And if we know where efficiency lies in the natural world, then how do we take what Mother Earth's already trying to do and help it out a little bit? If I know what the ideal case is, then I can make some really powerful coastal management decisions in order to help out and give it that critical piece that might otherwise be missing. Now, obviously, we can't make a ton of wind blow all the time, right? There are limitations to it, but I do hope that it will kind of shed some more light into those variable interactions that leads to resiliency.
Along those same lines, too, is what can we as a public do to help preserve dunes and promote their recovery?
Well, definitely don't walk on them.
Okay, all right.
That goes without
all right.
saying. I mean, we've had sign campaigns for years now, and that doesn't really help very much.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, definitely, because whenever you walk on the dunes, it's obviously gonna it really hurts the rhizomes that are underneath, and they're pretty fragile from that sort of repeated trampling. I think a lot of it's advocacy. Going to the beach and just taking a second to notice the dunes. I feel like a lot of us get sucked into going to the beach for the beach, and so once we get there, we're looking out towards the waves, but like if you turn around and look, that's the barrier that's preventing your house from potentially flooding during the next major storm. Doing little things like if you have beach rack that washes up on your shore, and maybe you're a homeowner or maybe you're just visiting, but you can move that rack, towards the dune line, towards the toe of the dune, and then it would help it build it out, make it thicker and wider, and help it prograde on its own. So there's little things like that you can do, but yeah, I think the biggest thing is just take a second and notice them. It's amazing how little recognition they get. And I always, whenever I teach physical geography on campus, I always, whenever I get to my coastal geomorphology section, I show up a photo of the beach, and I have my class, okay, label everything you can see on a piece of paper in this photo. Only about 30% of them notice the dune. And it's just, I think that's a real kind of indicator to where we're at as a society.
Final question. We always like to try to get any fun, exciting, or crazy stories. Anything else that you'd like to share along those lines?
I always say that if you're a field researcher, you kind of have this sort of soft spot for type 2 fun. Type 2 fun's where, nothing's going to plan, you ran out of water, or it's hotter than you were expecting, or you get caught in a sudden rainstorm, When I was going down to go collect that equipment in advance of the storm, I'm out there and the wind's whipping and it's awesome. I'm taking all sorts of photos and videos, just like really taking in the change occurring before my eyes. But when I finally got the first load of equipment completed, and first load, because it took me 4 days to set everything up, and I only had, well, the weather window kept getting shorter, but I only had on the order about maybe like 3 hours to get it all down. So, I'm moving at a pretty quick pace. But I underestimated how high the storm surge that was already coming in was going to offset the high tide prediction. And so by the time my cart's loaded up with thousands of dollars worth of equipment, I looked down the coast and I realized that I'm not going to make it. Because literally the beach is it's covered up by water. It's not gone, but it's covered up by water. And okay, well, it's fine. I'll just, hang tight on top of the dune, because I know that my overwash plane's going to flood now. And when I couldn't pass, it was still an hour from high tide. So that's when your gears start turning. You're like, uh-oh, that's probably not going to bode very well. I post up on top of a dune, hopefully waiting out the storm surge, and it's like initial flooding event in advance of the storm. And then underneath my tarp and the wind's whipping next to metal and all this equipment, trying to stay dry. I check the radar just to see what's going on, and yeah, it's definitely the outer bands of Ian. And I was like, well, this is too close for comfort.
Right, yeah.
But and you're questioning life decisions and all that stuff at that point in time. But I mean, I had to get that equipment. There's no way around it. So yeah, I'm waiting out there and checking the radar and waiting for the tides to go down and watching the whole system deflate. I would say it was definitely a intimate experience with how that overwash plane was going to fare in that particular storm event. But yeah, it was definitely the closest I've ever been to a storm, or I've never been out there to where I literally got stranded and had to wait it out. But it was all right. It was only like 6 hours. I was able to
That's all.
make my
Good
way
job.
back. Yeah. What was fortunate though is that I think that, like I said, I'm pretty sure that they said there was a cold front that was butting up against Ian, And in that process, it was squeezing out a lot of that moisture. And so because of that, I wasn't sitting underneath what looked like a lot of rain on the radar, the outer bands of this massive system. So I'm very fortunate for that, but it was just a matter of waiting for the water to go down.
That's wild. Well, any other final things you'd like to share with anybody? Any final statements or suggestions or plugs or anything like that?
No, I was just going to say, if anyone listening wants to, get a hold of me about research or anything along those lines, you can find my email address on the department website. It's just petert@email.sc.edu. And this has been great. Thanks again for all that Meter does. And I've been a fan of the podcast since it first dropped. So it's been really cool to get the offer to be on here.
Thank you so much, Pete, for taking time to share your research with us. As always, super fascinating. And if you in the audience have any questions about this topic or want to hear more, feel free to contact us at metergroup.com or reach out to us on Twitter at meter_ENV. And you can also view the full transcript from today in the podcast description. That's all for now. Stay safe, and we'll catch you next time on We Measure the World.